one of my hobby horses, one of my favorite things to talk about here is, they said it on page 171, therapists assume too much responsibility for both causing the client's pain and for alleviating it. And we'll talk here at the end on this point, but Tiber says that your biggest obstacle to being an effective healer is your own discomfort with certain feelings. That discomfort that so oftentimes is based on our own problematic ways of relating, our own familial rules. So the biggest thing that's going to stop you all from being helpful isn't going to be the theories. It's not going to be your orientation. It's not your competence, whether you know enough or not. It's your own inability to sit with big emotions, to sit with sadness, to sit with anger, to sit with guilt, to sit with shame. The whole issue of this dynamic of emotion to emotion to emotion, this constellation of affect, is that clients have not been allowed to feel a single one. And so because they haven't been allowed to feel sadness, right, they have to present with anger. Because they haven't been allowed to experience anger and express anger, they have to present with sadness. And so our job, and I hope this is I hope you guys are drawing this from this class, we have to do the work. We have to do the work ourselves. We have to change our relationship to feelings. We have to learn that sadness is a friend. We have to learn that guilt is a friend, that shame is a friend, that these are messengers. That's what feelings are, they're messengers. If we don't listen to the message, they just come back even louder and even louder and even louder. Oftentimes our parents aren't able to listen to the message because the same thing that can happen with the therapist caring about people like them, this is how people are, right? This is how our parents are. They want us to like them. So if we say, Dad, you're hurting me. We say, what's wrong with you? I'm not hurting you. I care about you, and this is for your good, right? And essentially what we say is, you're not allowed to be mad at me. As a parent, that's what we say. You're not allowed to feel anger towards me because I'm an authority. And so then we dispel that. Then we're left with, well, what can we feel? Sadness. All I can do is be helpless here and kind of be beat up. So we have to change our orientation to emotions, and we have to change our orientation to responsibility for others' emotions. We are not causing the client's distress. It's simply being revealed. Nor is our responsibility to alleviate the distress. What humans need, what we are made for, is not a distressless life. We're not made for a pain-free life. We're not made to completely escape suffering. Indeed, right? We believe in the cross. This is something that we have to do. But what's beautiful about Christ dying on the cross is he says, hey, there's nothing I won't join you in. And that's what we are learning to do with and for our clients, is to say, hey, there's nothing that you will feel here that I'm not willing to join and be with you in. I'm not going to force you into any feelings you don't want to feel. I'm not going to try to get you feelings that I think you should feel. But where you go, I'll be there. And we can be there together, and we can help you to become more familiar with the terrain of your own interior world. And so, oftentimes feelings don't just occur in a single feeling, right? A client will present, right, with a predominant affect, as we talked about, with a characterological affect, a kind of theme of emotion that comes up over and over and over again for their lives. But the reality is that there's other emotions that are connected here. And so what we need to do, fundamentally as therapists, we are slowing down and helping the clients to connect with their own experiences. And so when the clients are in these big emotions, we're learning to simply slow down, slow the client down, and helping them to connect with whatever it is that they're feeling. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but our goal is to identify the emotion, to join the client in the emotion, and then to affirm the emotion, to help the client to understand that this emotion is a normal, natural, understandable experience based on the context. So much of what we're doing for clients is helping them to contextualize their distress. Nietzsche says, anybody who has a why can withstand almost any how. So many times when our clients are coming to us, it's not just because of the sadness or the pain or the difficulty. It's because they don't understand the meaning of their suffering. Suffering alone, suffering out of context is unbearable if it's not intelligible, if we can't make sense of it. And so what we are helping the clients to do is to understand that their suffering has a meaning, it has a connection, and it has a purpose. And then we're helping them to connect with the message of those initial experiences that brought up the sadness, the difficulty in the first place. And so when we can help the clients see this interrelated sequence, we're helping them to become more comfortable with feelings as a whole, to see that actually these feelings often occur in a predictable way, and so they're not actually so chaotic, they're not so unknown. And here, I think, something that's not mentioned in the book, but a theory that is just emerging, and it's kind of taking the therapy world by storm right now, is internal family systems theory. Show of hands, who's familiar with internal family systems theory, or who's heard of it? Raise them up high. Yeah, okay, great. Can anybody tell me the basic kind of thesis or the basic idea of internal family systems theory? Let me rephrase that. Who can tell me the basic idea? Yeah.
We have an internal family system.
Yes, and what does that mean?
It means that there's different parts of us within us that have like different feelings and different desires, and they can conflict and repress each other,
Mm-hmm.
and we could have different relationships, like ourselves can have different relationships with different parts of us.
Yes.
And have different feelings towards different parts of us.
Excellent, yes. And so there's an external family system, right? I have an external family system. I have a mom, a dad, I have 2 brothers, 2 sisters. And we talk about, in the family system, typically certain individuals get constrained into these rigid roles, right? Maybe one person's allowed to be angry, but nobody else is. Maybe dad's allowed to be angry and walk around the house and stomp and throw things. But if anybody else shows anger, it's not allowed, it's crushed. Maybe the parents are kind of really muted emotionally. So the kids are just freaking out and exploding full of anxiety, but the parents kind of don't respond much. There's kind of a muted emotion. And so there develops these kind of strict family rules. And what happens is that internal family systems theory believes that we integrate, integrate's not the word I was looking for, we internalize the different kind of members into our family in our own psyche, right? We'll talk about with attachment theory, the way parents treat the children is the way that children learn to treat, who said it? Themselves. Yeah, the way parents treat children is the way that children learn to treat themselves, right? So one of the things I say to people is, if you want to become a good parent, notice, how do you respond to yourself when you're angry? What's the kind of internal conversation? What's the internal reactions? Because when your child makes you angry, you will respond to them in the same way. And that's a pretty scary thought, to realize that however I respond to myself internally when I make a mistake, that's going to be the template for which I respond to my children making a mistake. And then guess what they're going to develop? That same response to themselves. And so internal family systems believes that yes, we are a unity, right? We are one person, but it holds that for a long time psychology has underplayed the role of multiplicity. That psychology has kind of said, like, you know, you're like this big arrow, right? And we just got to figure out how to make everything in your personality line up so you feel like this one complete being. And there's a real value to integration, but we have to understand that integration always occurs by a culmination of separate parts. And so in internal family systems theory, IFS, we believe that the person is a system, a self-system of interrelated parts. And so all of these different parts of us can actually operate autonomously. What they call them is sub-personalities. And these different sub-personalities have relationship inside the person, right? So I have I have a part of me that holds a lot of anger, right? I have other parts of me that say, hey, John Paul, you shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't be angry at people, right? So this part of me will try to hold out that anger, right? But if something triggers that anger, all of a sudden this angry part blends, kind of takes over, and I'm in this totally different headspace. And we've all been here before, right? Where something happens, whether it's we're really sad, we're really angry, we're really frustrated, we're really filled with shame. And then the next morning we wake up and it's like, I don't know what that was, right? I don't know where that came from. And it makes a lot more sense to say, okay, there was a part of me that was kind of in the driver's seat at that moment that was filled with shame, that connects to all the experiences of shame in my life. That part of me kind of took over. And so I was thinking, right, another way to see this is that we can look at different parts as different schemas. The different parts have different internal working models, right? So I might have a part of me that relates to men one way, and maybe with men, I try to dominate and be in control, because that's what I learned, like I have to do in male relationships is the bigger person survives. But maybe with women, I fawn and try to, be very pleasant and very likable and, be very attractive so that I can stay connected. And it would make sense, right? Because maybe being very kind of softer emotionally and very vulnerable worked really well to stay connected with my mom. But if I brought that up with my dad, it would be like, nope, cut off, right? And so there's different parts of me that learn to relate to different people in different ways. And so the same way that our external family system has these rigid rules, our internal family system has these rigid rules. And so IFS, the beauty of this is that these different parts of us, they're not just feelings. It's not just, sadness, but we can actually treat it like a personality. And that sounds wacky and crazy, right? To say, you actually are made up of like 30 different personalities within you, right? It sounds like, do I have multiple personality disorder? And the answer is no, you don't have multiple personality disorder, but you do have multiple personalities. And you know this every time you go home for vacation, every time you go home for Christmas break, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I've done all this growing, I've done all this maturing, I'm a new person. And I show up, I walk in my door, and all of a sudden I'm a 14-year-old brat. And we can say, what happened? I did all this growth and I did all this changing. But we can say, well, in that system, you were able to experience this growth. But you stepped back to the old system. And when you step back into the old system, these parts of you that know the rules of that system and know how you learn to protect yourself showed up and kind of took over. And so the cool thing about IFS is that we can actually have a conversation with these different parts. And this is intuitive as well, right? The interior journey, as soon as we're alone, we're talking to ourselves. We're having a conversation. But who's talking to who? Right? We can say one part of us is talking to another part of us, right? One part of me would love to blow off all my responsibilities and book a trip to Fiji and be like, no, I don't need to show up to work. I don't need to show up to class. Like, I'm just going to go and live my life and seize the day, right? Another part of me says, John Paul, that's crazy. You actually probably wouldn't be very satisfied with that. And actually, the responsibilities and connections you have are really meaningful, right? One part of me might want to tell my boss off. And another part of me might say, no, John Paul, you actually need to be obsequious. You need to bow down to your boss. You need to praise their every word. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to have a good relationship with them. And what we experience is this chaos of getting drawn in back between each part. But we can learn to kind of isolate the part and have a conversation. And this sounds wacky up here, but it actually works. So And you can do this, and we've done this. I kind of did this a little bit already in the role plays, right? Somebody would say something and say, okay, where do you kind of feel that in your body? Oh, anxiety, it's in my chest. And so that's a part of them, and a part of them that's feeling anxious, a part of them that shows up in their physical body, in their chest. And so then we can direct the attention to the chest. And we can ask this question and say, what's that part of you saying? Now the key is that when we're asking that question, we're not trying to figure out. We're not trying to guess. We're not trying to kind of figure out the mental map. What we're doing is much more like fishing, right? And when you fish, you cast out the bobber and you just let it sit. You're not like casting out the bobber, then jumping into the water and like trying to get the fish to come out, right? And you're not like over here, over there, or you won't be a very good fisher if that. We're casting out the bobber. Sometimes what happens immediately when you cast out the line?
You get a bite.
Sometimes immediately you get a bite, and that can feel really exhilarating. Sometimes, what's the other thing that can happen quite often?
Wait for a while.
You wait for a while. Then maybe after 20, 30 minutes you say, okay, I'm going to pull back the bobber, I'm going to make sure that my line's on there, and I'm going to cast it out again. That's what we're doing. That's the attitude that we have when we're kind of asking these questions. But we can focus in on the chest, the tension. How's it showing up? Oh, it feels like a ball. It feels like a rock. It feels like a vacuum. Then we can ask this question just like we're floating out the bait. We say, what's it saying? It's saying that I hate feeling like this. Or it's saying that I'm going to be judged, right? This is intuition. It's a way of knowing that's not based on logic, that's not based on rationality. It's a way of knowing that we don't know how it works. And then we can actually learn to have a conversation with this anxiety. We can say, oh, what's the fear? That I'll be judged. And if you were judged, what would happen? Oh, I would feel filled with shame. And then if you were filled, oh, I couldn't deal with those feelings of shame because I can never get out of them. And we can hear that there's a process there that is afraid of happening internally. And then we say, okay, well, what would the context have to be like to let yourself feel anxious here? Oh, well, if I knew I wouldn't be judged, maybe I could let myself feel that way, right? And then we can kind of help test the waters. And so IFS has described three main parts, right? And these parts are, in different theories, have called them different self-states, different internalizations, interjects. So different theories call them different things. But our managers is exactly what they sound like. They're in charge of the everyday operations of our lives. And the job of the managers is to, at all costs, keep away the exiles and stay in control. Our exiles are those parts of us that we or others have deemed unacceptable, and so we've repressed them, right? These are the parts of us that we've shoved in a box and we say that we're not going to go anywhere near them, right? A very common kind of part that's exiled from men is what? Sadness, right? Men don't cry, right? Men don't feel sad. And so what happens is the manager's job, the exiles hold the painful emotions from painful experiences. They get shut up in a box, they get pushed away. However, the exiles are just begging to be seen, right? And so we can say, there's a part of us, this speaks to that aspect of ambivalence, right? That there's two sides. A part of us that is desperate to be seen and known. A part of us that's sad, that just wants a place to hold that sadness. And yet there's another part of us that says, no way am I going to let that sadness out. That sadness is a threat. I'm going to stay in control. So a lot of the time the managers are very kind of intellectual, right? Sadness might come up, that exile kind of might start emerging, and then all of a sudden the manager's like, no, this isn't what I should do here, right? This isn't safe. I shouldn't do this or in a classroom, or I shouldn't do this with another man, or I shouldn't do this. It doesn't make sense. So the manager's job is to keep the exiles at bay. The exiles hold painful and unacceptable emotions. And then there's firefighters. What do you guys think the firefighters do? What's in the name? That's one of the nice things about IFS is it's like really straightforward. What do you guys think the firefighters do?
They're there when everything hits the fan. Like it's chaotic. They're like save the day.
Exactly. The firefighters are the emergency responders, and the role of the firefighters is to escape when the exiles blend or take over, right? So firefighters often look like binge eating, alcohol, substance use, pornography, disassociating on 8 hours of Netflix, right? Doom scrolling. What else might be some examples of the things that people do in order to escape their emotions? Oversleeping, yeah. Workaholism, right? I'm just going to throw myself into my work. Fantasy, it could be a lot of things. And so the firefighter's job, now here's the deal. The manager's job is to keep the exiles away, but they're really concerned with the everyday operations. So the managers try to keep the exiles away, but in a way that helps functionality continue. The firefighters do not give a shit. They will do whatever it takes to get the bad feelings away, right? So the firefighters don't really care about whether what they're doing is going to be problematic or not, right? Something like cutting, something like binge drinking, something like drugs. They're just like, you know what? The MO is anything is better than here. And so managers oftentimes work in this kind of protective role, right? A lot of times at the beginning of therapy, when we're saying, what's the threat here? We're asking the managers, what are you afraid would happen if you let the exiles show up? And so I think this framework, the IFS framework, is far more intuitive, perhaps, than even the kind of constellation of emotions. The constellation of emotions is just describing this in different ways. So what we're doing in therapy, if you're working in IFS therapy, is you're helping the person to recognize these different emotional states. Now, the way we react, the way parts react to ourselves is the same way that parts react to other people, right? So say I have a part of myself that is filled with shame, and I escape that shame by criticism. You shouldn't feel that way. That's stupid. That's a stupid thing to feel so bad about yourself, right? So if somebody in front of me shows up with shame, that manager, right, that protector, is going to respond in the external system the same way I respond to the internal system. What questions do you guys have about IFS? Because I know I'm giving you guys a pretty broad overview. Yeah.
Do you tend to see that men struggle more with the managerial part than women?
Not necessarily, but I feel like you could probably make a pretty... No. But what you see is that certain, what we would call diagnostic categories, again, right, so this is actually a pretty good example. So we have this firing order, right? Anger, sadness, shame. And the anger protects against the sadness. So really it's kind of weird, but it's actually like we could put the sadness in parentheses in front of the anger, right? And so the sadness would be like an exile. But that feeling isn't allowed, and the anger would actually be a firefighter. And it's all keeping away from the shame. When people are depressed, it's typically because they're blended with exiles that hold sadness, right? When people are anxious, it's actually typically because they're stuck in managerial, in that kind of managerial headspace. And the best analogy here is that it's like driving a bus. Right? Say there's a teacher on a bus, there's a bunch of kids, and there's a bus driver. Everybody in that bus is good, but you do not want the 5-year-old driving the bus. And you probably don't want the teacher driving the bus either, but it'd probably be better than the 5-year-old. The best thing is that the bus driver's driving the bus, the teacher's managing the kids, and the kids are just being freaking kids, right? And so what we work with in IFS, there's the belief that there are no bad parts, even the binge eating parts, right? Even the aggressive parts, there are no bad parts, but parts have burdens, right? And so when parts of us get burdened with anger, they act out in angry ways. And if we can listen to the story of how that part got stuck with this job of being so angry that nobody is allowed to come anywhere near close, when we listen and we witness the story and we understand what that part is protecting against, we can do an unburdening process. And we can help that part that previously was this angry part to let go of the anger because they realize and believe that there's no need for that anymore. And one of the other aspects of the IFS theory is the belief of the self. And the self is undestroyable, it's always there, it's untarnishable, but essentially the true self is another phrase that's been used over the years that describes the same thing. And in fact, it's the same idea as no self in the Buddhist theories. But the self is this space of compassionate, open awareness. And so these parts don't trust the self because it's kind of like when people have been in this open-hearted awareness as kids, they got hurt. And so these parts said, hey, we're not going to let that happen anymore, so we're going to be skeptical about everything. And our role is to help build a relationship between the self and these parts to help these parts realize, hey, you can trust the self. And the parts learn to trust the self as the self emerges as a leader, as the self is able to contain and hold all the different experiences, and as the self is able to listen to these stories internally. Yeah. Any other questions about IFS? Yes.
Yeah, so I have two questions. So you had mentioned how like some people, I guess they experience like anxiety in their chest.
Mm-hmm.
Do people experience like other emotions in like other parts of their body by any chance?
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of people experience a lot more than anxiety in their chest too. So a lot of times you'll have people and say, oh, it's my chest, it's my chest, it's my chest. They say everything's in my chest. And I usually say, well, like, I work in this big office building, and everybody who works here is in the same building, but my office is pretty different than the office upstairs, which is pretty different than the bank downstairs. So even though it's all happening in the chest, it's happening in a lot of other places too. But yeah, tightness in the belly, right? The feeling of my stomach is turning, right? Headaches. Tension headaches, back pain, shoulder pain. A lot of emotions occur around the heart area. A lot of, especially if you have people who have trauma, there's a lot of emotional tensions that can get stored, a lot of parts, exiled parts that live in the sexual areas, right? Areas that were very traumatic. When those areas were stimulated, they can kind of hold a lot of tightness, right? So these parts can show up in really any part of the body, but typically they'll have the places that they kind of hang out. And that's one of the questions I ask people. I say, this feeling of anxiety that's emerging, like, where does it usually hang out in your body? Like, what area of your body does it like to occupy? Same thing with thinking parts, right? So people are like, oh, I don't know, it's in my head. And I say, oh, great, it's in your head. Where about in your head? Is it in the front of your head, back of your head, sides of your head? And people will tell you. If you can help them to realize, hey, I'm not trying to test you, and you don't have to find the answer. If you can help people to kind of cast out that bait and just sit there, it's remarkable that people say, oh, this part of me always shows up right here, and it feels like a steel beam that kind of sticks out of my forehead. That's what it feels like. I feel the tension right here. Or people can say, I have a headache just right here on the left side. Or maybe it is something like, honestly, my whole head, right? Something like dissociation, dissociative parts. People will often say, I feel like everything in my head is just a cloud right now. Or people will experience a sensation of numbness, right? Now, numbness is the absence of sensation, but it still is a sensation. And so we can be really skillful when we can help people connect with that. Yeah, so the body is your friend. And one of the beauties of IFS is it links very well our emotional states, our psychological states with the body, and really helps us to become more embodied, which is, I think, just absolutely needed, especially in our culture. Yeah, was there a follow-up?
Yeah, and then my other question was when it comes to managing firefighters, do you teach people to kind of just not see emotions as something bad, just trust yourself?
Yes. Well, You do a lot of other work first. But then you explore, okay, if you can help firefighters to see that the exiles can be handled without a need for escape, which is essentially what you're saying. If you can teach people that they can tolerate the sadness showing up and step into the sadness and really feel it, then the firefighters learn that they don't need to do that job anymore. So there's one aspect which is asking the firefighters, okay, you want to cut this person, like this firefighter in you wants to cut every time you're feeling overwhelmed. Are there any other options? Right, in DBT you talk about things like plunging your face in cold water, right? Or taking a cold shower, or exercising, right? So there's different levels of health and wellness in terms of how firefighters, and so there's a certain aspect of management where we're helping the firefighters to be less problematic in the ways that they're intervening. And essentially this is the thing. These parts are all good, but because they're all trying to protect you, they have all some underlying good intention. But the way they're carrying it out is a mess. Right? This firefighter that says, I don't want you to be stuck in shame forever. Like, bravo. I don't want that for anybody either. I don't want anybody to be stuck in shame for forever. But I also don't want you risking your life as you're slitting your wrists. You know, I wonder if we can find a way to have both of these ends meet. Yeah, John Paul.
Isn't also though to make sure that like you focus on that, like in one sense it's good to like give other like coping mechanisms or help firefighters be more helpful.
Yeah.
But we really want to like unburden the exiles.
Yes.
Which makes the firefighters less necessary.
Right. But if you go into unburdening the exiles before the managers of the firefighters are ready, they will just come out. And this is what can happen if we say, oh, let's just push through and be in the sadness, right? And then somebody's kind of like wrecked for a week, right? So remember, one of the beauties of internal family systems theory is the systemic perspective, that whatever we do, we want to make sure that it honors the system as a whole. And we want to recognize that if you change one of these parts too abruptly, the whole system is going to experience crisis, and that's likely just going to calcify and bring up even more problematic ways of relating. So one of the biggest problems that can happen in IFS, but also in therapy as a whole, is therapists they have an agenda to work with the exiles before the person's system is really able to tolerate that distress. So I used to, and this is, I think a burden in the therapy world. I heard in grad school, I'm sure you guys will hear over and over again, if there's trauma, the first thing that you have to do is go to the trauma. If somebody has PTSD, the first thing you do is treat the PTSD. You have to go to the trauma, you have to go to the trauma, you have to go to the trauma. The trauma is at the root of all their problems. And there's a merit and a value to this, but I think it's really overplayed, and I think it's actually a burden of the therapeutic world. In that it's so easy for us to just recapitulate problematic relational patterns by forcing somebody into their trauma. Now on the same end, we don't want to avoid it, and we want to help the person to see how their trauma is affecting them. But I used to kind of think of therapy a little bit more like okay, we're pushing this out of the way, pushing that away, and we're going into the emotion. And if we're feeling the emotion, we're feeling the affect, this person's going to find healing because they're going to have this catharsis, right? And now I think of therapy much more kind of as like, we go here and we go here. What are you afraid of? Can we establish safety? What's the fear if you open up? Well, you're opening up here, right? What might happen between me and you if you're going to show me these emotions? Oh, that sounds like it'd be pretty terrified to get stuck in shame forever. Would there be any possibility of not being stuck in shame forever? What would you think if you could experience just a little bit of shame at a time instead of 100% of it at a time? And so I see therapy now much more as kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth gently, but as it swings back and forth, it gains a little bit more depth, a little bit more depth, a little bit more depth. And what I believe this brings as well is that it brings an enduring change. Because we're not changing the symptoms, we're changing the system. And the symptoms are a manifestation of a systematic imbalance. And so if we can change the system as a whole, the symptoms are also going to diminish. So anger typically defends against unexpressed sadness. It's usually reactive. So usually there's a hurt first. We talked about that kind of rage cycle. And all of this, when sadness is felt, just sends the person into shame. And so what we kind of see is really it's a little bit more, rather than like 1, 2, 3, it's a little bit more like very quickly 1, 2, 3. But what they present with, what's visible on the outside, is the anger. And so what we want to do is we want to actually invite the client's anger. I'm so pissed at my mom. She's never there for me. She always forces me in their way. So we really invite that. We allow it to show up, right? And then we tune in immediately after. We say, okay, there's so much anger here. It makes sense to me. Now that you've given that anger some space, what are you noticing right now? And this is when people immediately, they tear up. And that's not the goal. The goal is not to make them tear up. The goal here is to help them to experience each successive emotion. And then they tear up and they pull back. You say, okay, I noticed that there was a lot of sadness coming up, but then it seemed like you kind of pulled back. I wonder what are you afraid might happen if you let the sadness? Oh, it would just remind me that I'm a terrible person. It would just remind me that I'm awful, right? So we're working to help the client slow down and experience each of these individually. And then we have shame. I love this. I had never heard this before, but it just hit the nail on the head. Shame is challenged by empathy rather than given legitimacy. When shame emerges, if we can empathize, if we can allow the shame to be here, again, right? We don't take responsibility for escaping someone from their shame, nor do we take responsibility for bringing the shame. Unless, of course, we did something to shame them, right? But we don't take responsibility for the shame that emerges in session. We help hold it. We help the client experience it. And so with the sadness, anger, guilt, oftentimes, anger is not allowed. What relevance do you... Oh, yeah.
What was the whole quote that you said? Shame is challenged by empathy rather than what?
Rather than legitimized. So when we empathize with shame, we actually provide relief rather than reinforcement. I think a lot of people fear that when someone's ashamed and we say, you're so ashamed right now, you feel like an awful person. We're afraid that we're going to be saying, you are an awful person in your table. And so we're like, I don't want to legitimize the shame, right? We're going to say, no, you're a great person. You're so great. You have nothing to be ashamed of. But that actually just leads the person with the feeling of, this person can't handle my feelings. I'm not allowed to just feel what I feel when I'm around this person. So when we provide empathy for shame, we actually bring healing. And so many clients are not allowed to feel anger because it would make them feel guilty. And so what they present with is sadness and helplessness, right? You did a great job of talking about that example with the client in the book. What populations that are especially relevant here at our school do you think this is especially relevant for?
What do you mean by what population?
Like what type of population of people?
People that struggle with, let's say, sexual desires.
Could be, but let's look broadly. Think a little bit more broadly. Yeah.
I think as Christians we can see anger as being sinful and
Yes.
wrong
Yes.
and too harsh.
Exactly. Christians, Catholics, people of a Christian background, you are going to see this absolutely everywhere if you guys are working with a Christian or Catholic population. Anger is a sin. Anger is bad. But really the message is you're not allowed to have boundaries. You're not allowed to tell someone that they're crossing the line. And in fact, we hear in the gospel, right, this past weekend that God's like, okay, you guys cross the line. I'm bringing out the whip and I'm raising my voice and I'm telling you, get the hell out of my dad's house because this isn't the place for that, right? Now, it does say, right, be angry but do not sin. And so that's what we're helping people to say is that, hey, there's actually nothing wrong with anger. Anger is just as legitimate as joy. Anger is just as important for the human person as joy is. Anger is just as important for the human person as gratitude. It's a messenger. It's a message. We need to learn how to listen to the message. So anger is the emotional response to an injustice or perceived injustice. And so if we tell people they're not allowed, if anger is the response to a perceived injustice, and we tell people that they're not allowed to feel angry, what are we telling them? We're telling them that, but what else? We're telling them that they're invalid, but what's specific, right? This is the syllogism, right? Anger is the response to an injustice. You're not allowed to be angry. What's the conclusion?
Every emotion you have towards an injustice is invalid or something like that. Like you can't feel any emotion towards your injustice.
Close.
You can't respond to injustice.
Yeah, you can't respond to injustice, right? But even more than that, if anger is the natural response to perceiving an injustice, you can't even perceive an injustice, right? Any wrong that somebody does, you have to write off, right? Which is not the message of Christ, right? He says, hey, he says, yes, forgive, right? 7 times 77, once over, always over, and a lot of big numbers for forgiveness. But he also says if somebody wrongs you in the church, you have to bring it to them. Right? He says, bring it to them first. If they don't respond, bring it to someone else and then bring it to them. If they don't respond, bring it to the authorities, right? So you'll see this a lot, especially in kind of more conservative families, that anger isn't allowed, but at the same time, what's bizarre is a lot of times one or both of the parents are very, very angry, right? It's that same thing. It's like, okay, anger's not allowed unless you're dad. It's like, I smell a rat in the cheese, my buddy would say. And so, sadness, if you can't perceive injustice, but injustice is happening all around you, of course you're going to feel sadness, right? But the family system has taught them, if you are angry, you're going to get guilted. You're going to be told that you're a bad person. And so sadness is actually much more safe. It's much more safe to be sad and feel hopeless than to be punished every day and be yelled at and be constantly criticized. So again, we help clients by slowing down this firing order. These individuals avoid interpersonal conflict. And the underlying belief is that the direct expression of their anger and their assertive expression of their own needs is hurtful and selfish to others. Yes?
Just some like things that I've seen in my own family. Just like people who I would think have like different constellations. Like, is that like where family therapy comes in, like where you'd have to like almost integrate like people's different patterns of sadness, anger, sadness, shame, etc.
Yeah.
And like, I don't even know, that was just more of a comment.
Yeah, so in family therapy, essentially what you're doing, just so with the individual, right, you're slowing the person down so they can say, oh, there's sadness here. Oh, and with the sadness, there's anger here. Oh, and there's also like guilt here. And you slow down so each has a place to speak. You do the same exact thing with the family, right? Dad's pissed. Okay, Dad, you're pissed. Let's give space for your anger. But also, let's bracket that anger a little bit and see, I'm wondering if anybody's feeling sad, right? So in family systems theory, you're identifying how certain parts or certain people in the family kind of systematically override others, and you're working to restructure. So this essentially happens on the familial system, and you're doing the same thing with the familial system, is slowing down and working to give voice to each and teaching each to listen to each other. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And excellent job speaking to this is a really important point with the characterological affect. The first emotion in the order is typically the one that's allowed or prescribed. The second is too threatening for the caregiver. So it's repressed or pushed away, right? It's exiled. And the third is shame or guilt. And it's just too disruptive for the person. So the person isn't able to experience the shame or guilt without being completely unwound and completely undone. And so again, what we're doing with the person, the resolution is to identify I cannot write from that side, I'm sorry. Join and affirm. We're helping the person, that is so ugly. Identify, join, and affirm. We're helping the person to recognize the feelings that are here in the present moment. We're joining experientially the person in those feelings, and then we're affirming. And when we say affirming, what we mean is that we're helping the client to understand that these feelings make sense in context. They make sense in context here, they make sense in context there. Excellent. And so attachment theory provides us with a great framework in terms of learning how to respond. And who can tell me, without me having to call on you because I'm going to be writing on the board, what a secure attachment is? Can someone tell me?
The caregiver is able to respond to the child's needs in like every situation, and there's like a trust and good relationship between them.
And so what does that develop in the child?
A sense of autonomy and like independence.
Yes. A securely attached child is a child that knows when I have a problem, I can bring it to mom and dad. And when I bring my problem to mom and dad, they can actually help me. And so they develop a confidence, right? That when things come up, I can be helped. Now, you don't have to be a perfect parent to provide a secure attachment. What you do need to be is consistently tuned into what your child needs. And sometimes what your child needs is an apology because you just were a buffoon and you completely dropped the ball, right? They don't need a perfect parent. In fact, it's impossible. But what they need is a parent who's able to recognize, hey, your needs are more important than me being right.
Is it also not just a problem, but like a success? Like if you bring
Yeah.
well,
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. That would be more of a secure base, right? That the parent celebrates autonomy. And so there are these two different aspects of secure attachment, which we've talked about before: safe haven and secure base. Who can tell me what a safe haven is? Maybe somebody who I haven't heard from very often this year. You can tell me, yeah.
Just like a place where you can confide and like
Feel comfortable, feel comfortable and confide in, like, together.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit more about that.
a place that you can come back to. It's like I don't know.
So it's a place, yeah, Grace.
I guess particularly when there's like struggles
Mm-hmm.
outside of yourself, or I guess struggles in general, you can come to them with those problems.
Exactly. And you can believe that those will be legitimized and held, right? So a safe haven is the ability for a child to come to the parent with their distress, and that the parent will be able to hold and contain their distress. And what a safe haven teaches is dependence. Dependence is not a bad thing. If somebody is only dependent, that's a problem, but the problem is a lack of balance. The problem is not dependence, right? What a safe haven teaches is I can depend on people when I'm in need, right? And a secure base, who can tell me what a secure base is?
Support that like caregivers offer in order to like foster independence within the child.
Precisely, yes. So secure base fosters independence. It fosters the child becoming their own person and feeling their own feelings and being their own being. And the secure base, when we provide the secure base, right, and the classic example of this is little toddler walks out to the door, turns around, looks at mom and dad, and then they wander off. That's great. That is perfect, right? Because what that kid's saying is, if I go away from you, mom and dad, will you allow me to be my own person and explore what's around this corner? And if mom says, where are you going? What are you doing? Now, of course, like within reason. Like there's a difference between wandering out and then going around the corner at a friend's house and wandering out in a mall or across the street, right? So there's a contextual basis here. But what the child is learning in that moment is, can I be my own person? Kid will come back, right? Or they won't. And then we'll have to go and run and pick them up because there was a crash, a bang, and a boom. And we'll be there to console them as well. But the secure base is when we actively support the child's exploration and increased independence. And this creates independence. And what these two combined create is interdependence. Or healthy differentiation. I can go and do my own thing and take care of myself. And I can also be in relationship and be connected and care for and receive care from others. So often, right, we polarize to one side or the other. Either, I don't need anybody in my life to help me. I'm a self-made man, right? Nobody's self-made. That's preposterous, right? Because humans, no man is an island, right? We cannot live outside of relationship. It's physiologically impossible for us to come into being outside of a relationship. Now, at the same time, we are all also the own bearers of our being. You really are your own. You really are your own person, right? John Paul II says that God respects man so much that he wouldn't take man from being an end to himself. God respects man and loves man so much that he gives him his own being for himself. He's an end in and of himself. And even God wouldn't use man as a tool, right? God welcomes man into joining in on his good pursuit, but that comes from the volitional choice of realizing like, whoa, God, that's a great plan. Why wouldn't I want to be a part of that too? It's not you have to be an instrument that does everything that I want. That's not God, right? It's you are your own person. And we learn with God to be co-authors of our lives, right? I think so often, right, especially for you all at your age, and I know for me when I was at your age, well, the majority of you at your age are probably sitting in the portal. What does God want me to do? What's my goal? What's my journey? And I remember there was a time that I was sitting and I was praying and I was like, God, like what do you want me to do? And I kind of thought that there was like some conveyor belt of grace. And like all I needed to do is like figure out what God wanted me to do and open the right door, and then I'd like be on the conveyor belt in this train and be like, ooh, that's like the path that God wants me to go through in life. And what I realized is that God is much more like a man that's really nice, that has a really big room that's full of every single possible toy and gizmo and gadget that you can possibly imagine. And he's saying like, hey, let's play together. What do you want to play with? And we're like, God, what do you want me to play with? And he's like, look, right, what does the prodigal father say what does the father say to the non-prodigal son? It's such a beautiful moment. Everything I have is yours. It's all yours, right? This happens in The Lion King, where Simba's sitting with his dad, and his dad says, look at everything that the light teaches, everything that the light touches. Like, that's all yours. So often we're like, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And we are so obsessed with trying to make sure that we're doing what God wants us to do, probably because we got taught you have to figure out what your mom and dad want you to do, and then you have to do it. Otherwise, you're going to get judged and shamed and disconnection, and maybe emotional and financial support will get cut off from you. And we're afraid that the same thing will happen with grace. And the reality is God's like, well, what do you want to play with? And all he cares about is like, hey, what do you want to play with? I put those desires in your heart wherever you go, whether it's the jungle gym or whether it's playing with an Android, or whether it's playing Halo, or whether it's art, or whether it's dancing, or whether it's singing. It's like, hey, I just want to be with you, and I'll sing along with you, right? I'll play Halo with you. I'll write a book with you, whatever it is. And so we want to help the client by providing the same type of thing. So they're like, hey, what I care most about is actually being with you. And so in this whole area of life, we can go wherever you want. What's most important to you? And I'll join you there, and I'll try to help you to do that even more meaningful and even more fully. So what we want to help our clients to learn is interdependence. That I can be my own person, and I can also be in a relationship. That I can be in a relationship that actually allows me to be even more of myself. I don't have to sacrifice my own individuality and cut off parts of myself in order to be in a relationship. And so when the other aspect here is that there are inevitably moments of misattunement, right? There's inevitably moments where the parents miss these things. But that's okay, because a parent that's creating a secure attachment will have the ability to say, hey, you know what? Dad raised his voice, and he got really angry at you, and that wasn't about you. That was actually about Dad. Dad wasn't handling his own emotions very well, and he took it out on you. That was really unfair. I'm sorry. Right? So children also learn that ruptures can be repaired. And again, this is what we want to teach our clients, that ruptures don't mean the relationship has ended. Ruptures are an opportunity actually for greater intimacy. This is one of the biggest difficulties in couples work, especially for couples. People believe that conflict equals disconnection. But what's on the other side of every conflict is an opportunity to know your partner more deeply, right? Because a conflict is inevitably, it's a misattunement. I'm talking about what are we going to do on Sunday, and you're talking about I'm so exhausted I can't even look at the future, and we're missing each other. So I'm saying, why can't we just agree on what to do? And you're saying, why can't you see that I'm distressed? What's on the other side of that conflict is an opportunity for me to see that my spouse is in stress and needs me to show up. And what's on the other side of that as well is an opportunity for my spouse to see, oh, it's really important to have a plan. And so on the other side of conflict is actually greater intimacy. And so we teach through experience that ruptures are not the end. They're not a period, right? But they're actually an opportunity to form a greater sense of trust, because trust doesn't occur when somebody's never hurt us at all before. Trust occurs when somebody slipped up, but we've been able to work through it in a way that actually affirms both sides, makes us feel known, helps them feel known, and actually resolves the core of the conflict. And so there's two types of dysregulation. That clients will typically present with. Do we have 2 minutes left? Yeah, we got 2 minutes left. Deactivation. And hyperactivation. And essentially, based on whether the caregivers are able to provide a safe base and a secure haven, switch those around, or not, children learn how to get their needs met, right? So deactivation occurs when children learn to consistently down-regulate their emotions, and make them smaller. So essentially, if a safe haven is never created, if every time I bring my emotions to mom or dad, they're crushed, we learn to say, oh, well, if I don't have emotions, I can't be crushed, right? So individuals learn to habitually downregulate their emotion. Hyperactivation occurs when the same thing might happen. Mom or dad weren't able to provide a safe haven, so the kid goes, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to turn up the volume. I'm going to turn up the volume so high in the middle of the supermarket that you're not going to be able to stop me, and you're going to give me that candy bar that I want, right? But this isn't something that just happens in the supermarket, right? The supermarket is just a manifestation of what already happens everywhere, which is the child learns, if I make my needs big enough, mom and dad can't but help to give me what I want. And so with deactivation, what we're doing is we're helping the client by helping them to identify and feel their emotions. And with hyperactivation, what we're doing is we're helping the client by learning to manage their emotions. And that's all that we will cover for helping clients with their feelings. On Thursday, we will pick up with, we'll do a role play. So I think a few of you reached out about the role play. And what I'm going to do is just pick a number between 1 and 10. And you three volunteers will pick a number between 1 and 10. And whoever's closest will be very generous in giving us their time and attention for practice. And yeah. Have fun trying not to be obsessed with spring break coming up and finishing all your work.